So we're going from the New Testament to the Old Testament. Imagine once again that you're talking to a friend. And this time the friend initiates the conversation by saying, look, I seem to hear that Christians have various views about marriage. I hear some really different ideas from Christians about what marriage should look like. Can you show me what Jesus said about marriage? And you go, well, yeah, sure, I can show you what Jesus said about marriage. So you open your Bible and you sit down with your friend over a drink and you open up to Mark chapter 10, verses 6 to 8. And you say, now this is Jesus speaking, and Jesus is in a bit of an argument with some people, and he says, from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female, and for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So once again, Jesus says, from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female, etc., etc. And your friend goes, oh, well, that's a bit weird. You know, I've always been taught that the universe was around for 13.7999 billion years before there was people. But this is Jesus saying from the beginning of creation, there was male and female. And you go, well, yeah, there's a difference between what you've been taught in schools or university and what Jesus said. The guy goes, oh, okay. And so he says it's between a man and a woman. You say, yeah, because when Jesus was talking about this, he was actually going back to the book of Genesis, where the verses are about a man and a woman being made, and therefore the logic is that's why marriage is about a man and a woman, not multiple women for one man or multiple men for one woman, polyandry and polyandry. So your friend says, so he's quoting from Genesis. What's that? Well, that's the first book in the Bible, you say. Well, who wrote the first book in the Bible, your friend says? Well, a guy called Moses. And he said, your friend says, well, why should I believe what Moses wrote? I'm only interested in Jesus. And you say, well, this is what's fascinating. If you look at another version of when Jesus was teaching on this topic, so Matthew chapter 19, verse 4 to 5, Jesus actually is saying that the Creator said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, unite to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Jesus said, for the Creator said that. But when you go back to Genesis, the Creator didn't say that. That wasn't one of the words that Yahweh spoke. That was the words of the narrator. So you can show this to your friend and you can say, so Jesus is saying that the narrator's words are as gold standard as the Creator's words. And hopefully that's going to cause lots of conversations over lots of drinks with you and your friend as you continue to delve into the strange teachings of Jesus Christ. Now, the reality is that Jesus talked about Genesis more than once. In fact, in the New Testament, there are 60 references to the first 11 chapters of Genesis, 60 allusions, quite strong. So it's quite a popular reference point, and I guess for good reasons, that after all was a foundation of everything that we live, breathe and touch and smell and eat and kill. So another example, for instance, about where Genesis comes up in Jesus' teachings is that, apart from talking about Adam and Eve, Jesus refers to the murder of Abel and the murder of Zechariah. This is in Luke chapter 11, verses 50 and 51. And what's fascinating is, of course, that the time span between these two individuals. Jesus is obviously teaching that Abel is as historically real a person as Zechariah. One was murdered in about 520 BC. The other one was murdered about 5000 BC and was recorded in Genesis 4. So once again, Jesus is finding all of these passages as being relevant history. And then the other one, I find it actually the most amazing one, he refers to Noah. So you can read about this in Luke 17, verse 26, and he talks about Noah and the flood and it wiping everybody out. And he's mentioning it in reference to the future for our planet. It's quite a profound bit of teaching. Some people say, well, John, that's really interesting. But, you know, Jesus might have just been trying to accommodate the people's thinkings at the time. You know, maybe he had a main message he wanted to get across, but he knew these people wouldn't be able to understand it. So he sort of fudged it, if you like. He accommodated to their limited understanding. And this is what's called, strangely enough, the accommodation theory. A guy called Johann Semler is probably the first person to ever document the idea in the 1700s. And so the first question is, did Jesus actually need to accommodate to people's thinking back then? When you think about it, the evolutionary belief is not really that complicated. There was nothing, and then there was something. The something became pond scum. The pond scum became pansies and petunias, penguins and parrots and poets and professors. It's pretty simple, and all of that happened over thousands and thousands of millions of years, billions of years. You might say, well, the people couldn't understand time like that, but that's not so. So you'll see there's a person there who actually died in about 347 BC, that's Plato. And Plato was teaching, according to Theophilus of Antioch, we can come back to maybe later, that the world was already millions of years old. So it's not like the idea that there was this ancient history is a new thing. This idea of time going back millions of years has been around for a long time. And it's not conceptually difficult. The other idea is that Anaximander, you can see a picture of a strange-looking man in a suit there. Anaximander, I always think of salamanders when I always think of him, and I find his name really easy to remember. He died about 540 BC. And not only does his name make you think of salamanders, but he had this idea that there were fish once upon a time, and inside the fish were humans. And as we grew and matured, we eventually got so independent that the fish spat us out and we got to walk around on land. Now, if you can conceptually understand that, did Jesus really need to have to accommodate to evolutionary beliefs when in some ways those ideas are not that strange compared to the idea that people grew up in fish as a species, that they were once our host? I don't think so. This idea of accommodation also assumes that Jesus wanted to accommodate, that he wanted to go softly, softly. If you read the Gospels, Jesus wasn't a person who went around softly, softly, not trying to create any waves. If you read in Matthew chapter 22 and verse 20 and chapter 23, he insults people. He calls them fools and blind guides because they had some crazy ideas about the past reality and the present reality. So Jesus doesn't have a reputation for always trying to accommodate and fit into everybody else's little boxes and be really sweet and nice. If someone's got a wrong idea, he tells them as it is. And Jesus wasn't averse to coming up with new concepts that would rattle your mind. You might remember in John chapter 3, in the dark of night, he met with a man and told the adult man, "You've got to be born again." And the adult man's thinking, "You're nuts, how can I possibly come out of my mother's womb again? I'm too big." And so Jesus is not one who has a reputation for accommodating. So I don't think you can write off Jesus' teachings that refer to Genesis as being about real events just because it was to do with on the basis of accommodation theory. Genesis is also relevant, though, if you're not a Christian and maybe you're considering Christianity or some other religion where there's a God involved. So we might call these people agnostic. They're open to the idea. There's two types of agnostics. One type of agnostic is that they don't know whether there's a God or not. And there's another type of agnostic that says no one can know whether there's a God or not. But let's just deal with the more common group of agnostics, the ones who aren't sure themselves whether there's a God or not. Now, you put yourself in their shoes. Go for a walk in an agnostic shoes. So you're starting to come around the idea there might be a God. What do you know about God? Well, you know that if there's a God, he's probably going to be all-powerful. That's a good start. If there's a God, that God's probably responsible for everything that's here. So it's a creator God. But if when you're at that stage of your mind, you're thinking that the world evolved, that's going to affect your view of the nature of the creator, isn't it? If you think that this God that was all-powerful could have chosen to snap their fingers and make the world instantly, compared to creating the world using an evolutionary process of millions of years that many people would say rather heartless, it's going to constrain your views about the nature of this creator. Now, before I go any further, it's very important to realise that Christians have different views about how we got to be here. Some of the friends, good friends I have that I meet with, that I admire immensely because of their enormous ways in which they sacrifice to show their love for Jesus, they do think differently. I'm just wanting to show you why many people, many Christians, believe what they do and why there's good reasons for believing it. And also to help you think through, if you like, some logic and inferences. Not everybody goes this deep on this topic. You know, some people have very different ideas. They never think about this much anyhow. They're too busy serving, washing toilets in the Himalayas, or serving in some other way, translating some language into the Bible for the first time. But we're dealing with what we have here is a discussion about, well, why do so many Christians believe one thing about Genesis? And why is it important? Now, the idea that how we got here affects the nature of God is certainly not lost on atheists. So David L. Hull, who you can see up there, he was a professor of humanities. Unfortunately, he died in 2010. He was a professor at Northwestern University in Illinois, a very famous man. In 1991, he published an article in a very prestigious journal called Nature. And the article is called The God of Galapagos, so the God of evolution. And he'd done his PhD in the history and philosophy of science. And he did a lot of work with taxonomy. So this topic was really near and dear to him, the philosophy that comes out of evolutionary beliefs. So in reflecting on what creation, what the evolution of this world says about God, he said this. And this is quite a very accurate quote, if you like, from that 1991 article. He said, "Whatever the God implied by evolutionary theory or the data of natural history is like, he is not the Protestant God of waste not, want not. He is also not a loving God that cares about his productions, his creations. The God of Galapagos, the God who made all of this via evolution, the God of Galapagos is careless, wasteful, indifferent, that means couldn't care less, almost diabolical. He is certainly not the sort of God to whom one would want to pray." So imagine having a beer with David L. Hull about the time he writes this article, and you get talking about it and you're exchanging your ideas, and then you tell him that actually in Christianity we believe Jesus created the world. Well, if he thinks that Jesus created the world via evolution, he's not going to think Jesus is the same sort of person that you and I think Jesus is. So in John 1 verse 3, it says that all things were created through Jesus. In Colossians 1 verse 16, all things were created by and for Jesus. So how you view how everything got to be here can affect your view of the Creator, or in particular Jesus. Another reason why Genesis is really important is it's affecting our laws. Now, obviously, it can affect laws to do with marriage, but put your hand up if you got my newsletter, my email newsletter. Anyone here? Just one or two. Okay, very good. So do email me and ask to put on it. It's quite interesting. So there's a picture of a judge there. That's a real judge, but that judge had nothing to do with what I'm about to tell you. She's a really interesting character, though. If you can Google the face and find her name, she's quite a spirited woman. But she's just there because she represents a judge. So in the UK, they have tribunals, which are not the same as courts, but they do have judges. In 2019, a case went before the judge. And in the case, there were a statement made by a man, Dr. David Makareth, is how I pronounce his name, and his belief, which became part of the court case, the tribunal's case, was that Genesis 1 verse 27, so God created man in his own image, in the image of God he created them, male and female he created them, had an implication about, therefore you can't just change your sex and your gender at will. It's something that you're born with, it's fixed. So he just made that statement, and the court picked up 3 statements he said, and they wrapped them up into 3 bundles, or the tribunal I should say. And the first bundle was Genesis 1 verse 27, written out in full. I've downloaded the documents, by the way. If you want a copy, email me and I'll send you the PDFs. One's about 40 pages, one's about 60. They're great reading. sort of. I find it really great reading. Anyway, to read there, Genesis 1 verse 27, in a tribunal, and it coming to the conclusion that this is not compatible with human dignity, that this is an offence to people. That's what that tribunal ruled. So welcome to our new world. It was appealed in 2022, and I'm going to leave you hanging on the edge of your seat. You're going to have to talk to me afterwards about what was the result of the appeal. I'd love to tell you. Let's move on. Now, the topic tonight is about text types. So you might loosely call them genres. When you read something, depending on what you think of when you first open the book, depends on how you're going to understand the book. So one text type is what we call historical narrative. It's narrative that's about stuff that's already happened, which is basically almost all narrative. So we're calling it historical narrative tonight. That's a text type. Another text type is poetic metaphor. There's a couple of others, and some matrices have been formed where there's lots and lots of subcategories, but we're just going to look at these basic ones. This is an introductory talk. We're not getting into linguistics, textual typology too deep, but we're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to stretch ourselves as we go along. So poetic metaphor means that what you're reading is not about real people, real events in real time necessarily. It's mostly there to generate some feelings, generate some ideas. Some of it may actually have happened, some of it not. And that's what the poetic narrative is, poetic metaphor is. And some people look at bits of the Bible and they go, well, that's poetic metaphor and this is historical narrative. Historical narrative means you are reading about real events that happened in real time, and there really was a person with that name, and they really did say these things, and these are the consequences. There's plots and there's storylines, which is the same thing, I guess. There's heroes, there's villains, there's consequences, and it flows. So that's the two basic text types that we're going to talk about tonight. Now, you'll see there's a reference there to some 5 loaves and 2 fishes. That's obviously a reference to the New Testament. So we're flicking over to the New Testament. John chapter 6, verse 1 to 14. Jesus does some teaching. He's got a massive crowd, much bigger than here. There's at least 5,000 men there. I presume they didn't count the women because they don't eat as much as the men. I don't know. But there was 5,000 men there at least. There obviously would have been some women and children in there in maybe bigger numbers. And he has to feed them all of a sudden. And someone says, how are you going to feed everybody? And he says, well, and then there's this boy. And the boy presents him with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And he miraculously, like he created the world, just expands this protein and this carbohydrate, and everybody gets their bellies full. Now, that's how many of us would read it, because when we read it, it doesn't tell us that it's a parable. It reads as if it's historical narrative. But Professor Marcus Borg, he died in, I think, about 2015, he said, no, that's poetic metaphor. It's just telling you a story. One of my good friends, she's a little older than me, when she knew a Sunday school teacher who said about this same parable, not same event that we think of as historical narrative, said, that's just a story. It's just to convey a message. What really happened is when the boy came along with the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, everybody else suddenly got pangs of guilt. And they suddenly, from under their robes, they pulled out their lunch boxes and all started to share their food. And that's all it's about. That's what a Sunday school teacher told my friend. So when it comes to Genesis, you can start to get an idea. If you think it's poetic metaphor, you're going to pull different meanings from that, and your constraints on what it means might be quite loose. So some people might not like the fact in Genesis chapter 1, Adam and Eve look pretty equal. So they concentrate on Genesis 2, where Eve comes along after Adam. So she now represents the culmination of all 6 days of creation. So who's the queen of the castle? Eve. Eve is superior. That's the whole message. Don't you get it? Now you can read about those thoughts being discussed by in the works of Phyllis Tribble. She was writing about it in the 1970s. I don't know whether she believed it. Some other people might not like the story, all of it, They want it as poetic narrative, and they get something, poetic metaphor, and they get something really different. They don't like the idea that people are mortal. So what they say is, and there's more than one or two of them, that once upon a time, the Archangel Michael and his wife decided to come down to earth and get bodies. And with their bodies, they are now called Adam and Eve. And they live in a garden, but they don't just want to stay there, they want to progress. So they eat some fruit and they leave the paradisical Garden of Eden. And we're so glad they did. If they hadn't have done that, we'd be still stuck up there with our spirit bodies. We've never had the opportunity to come down here and get our own bodies. Do you know who it is? Joseph Smith, who was born in 1805. And he started this new religion called, colloquially, Mormonism. That's their teachings. I went to great pains to try to make sure I understood it really well. I remember them showing me a little film when I was much younger in my house once. I just made sure that they haven't changed it at all, but no, it's still the way it is. So obviously, though, if you regard Genesis as historical narrative, what you pull out of it is going to be very confined to the language that's there. Okay. Now, are these two types clearly delineated in the Bible, these two types of texts? Well, yes, they are. So if you read Exodus 13 to 17, skip over 15 because it's a bit of poetic metaphor, you're going to be reading about the Exodus. You're going to be reading about Pharaoh and an oppressed people and the parting of the oceans, huge numbers of people being killed. It gets quite good at that point in time. People being led by clouds in the day and fiery columns at night. Food just coming out of nowhere. It was a Communist Party's delight. You didn't have to work for it. It was just wonderful. And that's historic narrative. We assume that what we're reading is true because that's the genre we take it as to be. It's a classic example of historical narrative. And in case you're wondering, there are 15 reasons for believing that when they wrote in a text type of historical narrative, we're going to get to that, how do you know, that they actually thought it was about real events, real history. If they wrote in that text type we call historical narrative, they really did think that this is the real deal, guys. Now, poetic metaphor looks totally different. So this is, we skipped one. There we go. Psalm 98, and some of you might have sung songs about it. The rivers clap their hands, the mountains sing for joy. And we know instantly, well, hang on, the rivers don't have hands. They're going to find it really awkward to clap. So obviously there's some words here that don't have their normal meanings. We have to understand this as creating some feelings, and it's a classic example. Some poetic metaphors, some texts that are clearly poetic, do a bit of a mix. So Psalm 78 has got a lot of historical events in it, real things in real time to do with Exodus, but also says that men ate the bread of angels. Now that didn't happen in Exodus. When you read Exodus, there's no bread of angels. They got manna from heaven, but we don't believe that the angels have bakeries and have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to make a decent loaf. So we understand, well, that's poetic metaphor. But there's a bit of a mix. Now we're going to look at, well, how do we know what text type it is? Well, one thing we could do is we could look at the hostile witnesses and the friendly witnesses who are experts in this field. I'm not a professor of Hebrew. I can't speak Hebrew, but like a judge and a good scientist, I can sift through the evidence and I can absorb a little bit of stuff. So what's a hostile witness? A hostile witness in this case is someone who is an expert, because they have to be an expert hostile witness, an expert in Hebrew, who doesn't actually believe, though, that what it says is true. So a hostile witness in this context is someone who's not constrained by a preconceived belief situation to say, well, it must actually be true. So we're going to look at what one of those people says about the text type. And then we're going to look at a friendly witness, who is someone who also has a belief about what text type it is, but actually does believe that it's true. So the first one is James Barr. Now, James Barr was a Oxford Regis professor of Hebrew from 1978 to 1989, so 11 years. He wasn't a fly-by-night guy. He did fly. He was a pilot in World War II of torpedo bombers. So he went from flying flat planes at great risk, dropping torpedoes, to being a professor of Hebrew in Oxford. Some people have some really interesting lives. Now, he wrote a letter in 1984, not that long ago really, and he said that probably, this is quite a good quote, quite a direct quote, word-for-word quote, probably, so far as I know, there is no professor of Hebrew or Old Testament at any world-class university that does not believe that the writer or writers of Genesis 1 to 11 intended to convey these three things, and I'll ad-lib a bit now. The first one is that the world was created in six series of days, and each day was the way we experience a day today, 24 hours long. The other intention of the author is that the genealogies that we see in Genesis 1 to 11, by simple arithmetic, can enable you to work out the age of the earth. And the third thing he says that the writer intended to convey when they wrote Genesis, or writers, when they wrote Genesis 1 to 11, is that there was a worldwide flood, Noah's flood, he says, that caused the extinction of all human life and animal life except that which was in the ark. So he's saying that he doesn't know any professor of Hebrew Old Testament at any world-class university that has a different view. He said we all believe that this is what the writer's trying to get you to believe is actual truth, actual history. So that's our hostile witness. A friendly witness. So Edward J. Young, he was a professor for a much longer period of time. He was a professor from 1936 to 1968, 32 years at Westminster Theological Seminary. The last 29 years, he was assistant professor or professor. He was good at 26 languages. When we say good, he could read or speak 26 languages. He just absorbed them. He was a fascinating man. And Hebrew was his love, of course, and that's why we're talking about him today. And he said that when he talked about the writer of Genesis and what that text is actually saying, not the story, what the text is trying to convey, is Genesis 1 is not poetry, saga, or myth. It is straightforward, trustworthy history. And inasmuch as it is divine revelation, it accurately records that of which it speaks. So then we have two different professors, one who believes that the writer intended to tell you that this was true, but the professor doesn't believe that was really the way the world came to be. And the other professor who also believes that's what the writer intended, but that professor actually does believe that is a true record of the world. But what we want to do is what I did in my book. We want to look at the evidence. So that's what we're going to do now. So we're going to introduce a fellow. Yoda. So this is going to be a memory prompt, I hope. I hope when you think about this talk, you're going to think about Yoda and the way Yoda speaks. So a guy called Charles V. Taylor first alerted me to one of the ways in which we can quantifiably and therefore objectively say whether a text type in the Old Testament is historical narrative or poetic metaphor. One of the things we can do is look at the grammar. So when we say something like the cat ate the mouse, we use a grammar syntax, a rule that says subject, verb, object. Cat ate mouse. Some of the TESOL teachers are nodding quite well. If you wrote Hebrew poetic metaphor, you have to use the same convention typically. Typically, not always, but in poetic metaphor, Hebrew would write the same thing. Cat ate mouse. But what's fascinating, in the text type that is historical narrative, it's different. It's verb, subject, object. So, ate, cat, mouse. Now, 41% of languages roughly do it our way, SVO. Less than 7% of languages does it the Hebrew historical narrative way. What do you think about Yoda? Any ideas about how Yoda speaks? He uses object, subject, verb. And the interesting thing is that language type is really rare. Only about 0.5% of languages talk the way Yoda does. But you don't have to remember all of that. All you need to remember is that there is a quantifiable way of knowing whether something is historical narrative or poetic metaphor, and that is you look at the prevalence of the order of SVO or VSO. Now, the ratio is 3:1. Now, tell me Gibbon, as far as I know, he's not a Christian. I was going through his works. He wrote a 1,000-page, 2-volume book on syntax of different languages. And in that book, I found a reference to Genesis 1. And he says Genesis 1 verse 1 is VSO. Any of you can know a little bit about Hebrew. It's quite obvious, actually. And he says that continues all through Genesis. And the ratio between the VSO and SVO in Hebrew narrative to poetic metaphor is 3:1. So it's a big difference. So think of Yoda when you're trying to work out whether Genesis is historical narrative or poetic metaphor. Just think about the odd way he speaks and the way he mixes up stuff. So that's a quantifiable sort of grammar way. The next way is a little bit more subjective. Poetic narrative is often contradictory to the rest of Scripture. So you might read in 2 Samuel chapter 22, verse 2-3, that God is a rock. It actually says also that Yahweh is a rock. You might read in Deuteronomy 32 that God is a rock. And you think, what's going on here? I thought God could speak and do things. You know, rocks don't do a lot. And of course, you would realise, well, that's probably because that's poetic metaphor. And you're right. That's a song of David in 2 Samuel 22. It actually is called a song. And Deuteronomy 32, that's a song too. So we're not surprised to see language that has words that have lost their real meaning, but they're meant to create a feeling. So poetic metaphor often has ideas or words at face value that contradict the rest of Scripture. Leviticus 11 verse 1 says, God said. And so does the beginning of every other chapter all the way through to chapter 24 in Leviticus. Each chapter starts with, God said. So we know God is alive. Acts 14 verse 15, the living God who created the world. What do we see when we look at Genesis compared to the rest of the Bible? Well, we see harmony. So God created the world in 6 days and had a rest on the 7th. In Exodus chapter 20, what happens? Verse 8, the 10 Commandments come along. We're meant to work for 6, have 1 day off. So it's in harmony. Exodus 31:17, it goes even stronger. It says, because God created the world in 6 + 1, and that's the way we're going to live our lives and must live our lives for pains of death. So we see harmony when things are in historical narrative with the rest of Scripture compared to a poetic metaphor. So far we've got 2 ways of being able to look at a text type and say, well, I don't know what it is. How do I go about it? Now we've got 2 ways of understanding, okay, this is what historical narrative would look like, and this is what poetic metaphor. This one looks a bit complicated, but hang in there. I enjoyed being able to nut this out. So you know in English, we do things to our verbs to get them to do different things. So kill becomes killed if you want the verb to talk about the past tense. Walk becomes walked. So we have forms of verbs, and depending on the form, it depends on what happens to the meaning of the verb, doesn't it? ING is a form that makes a verb do something different to ED is a form that makes a verb do something in the past tense. Now what's interesting about this thing called the vav-consecutive, that's what it's called. It's a form that gets attached to nerves. It's a form that gets attached to verbs and turns them into sequential past tense. Now in Malaysian language, and I've already met someone here who probably can speak Malaysian well, Malaysian language, they do interesting things. They can have several prefixes and several suffixes on a word at the same time. We don't generally do that in English. Our English language is so simple. One affix, one suffix at a time, thank you. Don't try to do anything more to it. But Malaysian language can have suffixes and prefixes at the same time. Now, if I was to make a sequential past tense out of a verb, and I got to create the English language, I would probably do something like this. And then killed. So kill would be my verb, and I'd say I want sequential past tense, so from now on, I'm going to stick this form at the beginning and this form at the end, And so it'd be and then walked, and then killed. And that's what the vav-consecutive does. And as I said, you can see it going back here. You can see the red bit shows you the different ways to write a vav-consecutive. Now, why is this relevant? Whoops, too much. So when you look at a text type, you can count the vav-consecutives and you look at how common they are, and that will tell you loud and clear what the writer was trying to do. So in Genesis 1, verse 1 to 2, verse 3, there are 55 vav-consecutives. But when you look at Genesis 49, which is a poetic chapter, guess what? There's only 15 of them. It's a ratio of about 3:1. It's going to be really obvious as you read the text, wow, it's full of these and then killed, and then walked, if you like, these vav-consecutives. It must be a text type of historical narrative. To back that up, when you don't see many of them, you can understand it because you start to see some of those other elements of poetic metaphor come through. So in Genesis 49, you read about Judah being a lion cub and Issachar being a donkey. Now we know Judah wasn't really a four-legged quadruped mammal called a lion, and we know Issachar wasn't really a donkey, so it all fits in, isn't it? It's all meshing together. So when you get a few of these signs all pointing to one text type, then it gets quite strong. It gets even stronger. So now we've come across 3 ways in which, if you were a Hebrew reader and you were reading Genesis for the first time, you would automatically be assuming this text type is historical narrative. So there's 3 ways so far. 2 to go. This is a particle. Now, Hebrew had a number of particles. They're not usually translated. There are little markers, if you like, that help a reader of the language to know how a sentence and a phrase all hangs together. You can count these. And once again, how frequent they are tells you a lot about the text type. So in Genesis 1, verse 1 to 2, verse 3, there's about 110 of them. And that works out at a ratio of about 15%. Poetry is much less. There's a bit of a table there. In true poetic metaphor, these particles, which you won't see in our English Bibles typically, are very rare. But when you get into prose or historical narrative, they're getting more common. Look how common Genesis is. 24% of the content is particles. It's about 110 particles over 470 words, and there's 3 different types. So once again, it's not something that's subjective. All you've got to do is just count the particles, count the 3 different types in Genesis 1, verse 1. And this last one, if you really want to read some good grammar about Hebrew and statistics at the same time, then this next bit's for you. I've got the paper. It's about 104 pages long. It's written by a Professor Stephen Boyd. There's a lot of statistics in it, and there's an enormous amount of data. And he was looking for the ultimate way to know whether a text type is historical narrative or poetic metaphor. And what he found was that there's another ratio. So he's looking at finite verbs. Now, finite verbs are just verbs that have a subject and a tense. And then there's a few different types of these, and one of these is called a preterite. Just think of Vegemites, if you like. So he looked at the ratio of preterites, one type of finite verb, to all the finite verbs in any given text. And he found that this is a really strong indicator of text type. So you can see there that the tall columns represent a text type of historical narrative, and the small little bars represent text types of poetic metaphor. Look at the difference. If you had no other way to know whether the book you're reading or the chapter you're reading or the phrase you're reading is, the chapter you're reading is historical narrative or poetic metaphor, you could just count the number of preterites and then the total number of finite verbs, come up with a ratio, and bingo. It's such a strong indicator that if you have a text in front of you and you've got no idea what it is, if you can find out what this ratio is, then using his cutoff values and what we call a logarithmic regression analysis, you can say how certain you can be. Now, Genesis 1 verse 1 to 2 verse 3 has got such a high ratio that the probability of it being text type historical narrative is basically 1. It's dead certain. So we've gone now through a number of different ways to analyse a text type, and we've seen that it's not a subjective exercise in general. And so when we read Genesis, we're not Hebrew readers. This stuff doesn't jump off the pages at us, does it? But to them it would have jumped off the pages. And now you've got a key to understanding about, well, how should I approach it? What does the Hebrew language of the text tell me about my limits of being able to play with the text so much? Or to what extent? It basically says you can't. What it says is real events in real time. How does this relate to our message? Well, getting back to David L. Hull, we could say to him that our Creator is Jesus Christ. We read an historical narrative that tells us that it was created perfect. It wasn't created through a really horrible, messy, bloody, cruel method for no good reason at all. It was created instantly. And that same Creator God walked on earth and dwelt among us and is offered to take our punishment. And so our dry bones, our stony hearts, can come back to life. Just like he turned dust into life so many thousands of years ago. So I hope this helps you to navigate the different messages you might get as you read Christian books and listen to different Christian speakers. It's not an area that anyone needs to debate about. All that you need to debate about is what you're going to do with the fact that it's a text type of historical narrative. Are you going to believe it or not to believe it? That's up to you. Once again, remember that this is not a topic that a lot of Christians know about, but I'm really excited to be able to give you a series of 5 keys so you can be on firmer footing and see that it's not just anybody's guess. I love the Bible, clearly. I love the way it speaks to me about Jesus, and I love the way it tells you so clearly stuff and tells you so clearly whether that stuff is true or has just got an intended meaning. You know, Jesus so often said, this is a parable. You know, in Matthew 13, it says, the narrator says, Jesus told lots of parables. And then Jesus told this parable. And then someone says, Jesus, what did the parable mean? And Jesus said, the parable means this. You know, he's yelling out to you, this is a parable. So whereas John 6, verse 1 to 14 about the loaves and fishes, it's not a parable. I want to thank you very much for listening. This will become a film, so you can review it, and it'll be uploaded on my website. Please be in contact with me. Buy the book, which has been designed for non-Christians to read. And can we finish off praying, those of you that are Christians? I thank you, Jesus, that you are alive and well, and that for those of us that experience you, you put one foot in front of the other for us. Sometimes I think you drag us. We need to be dragged. Thank you, Jesus, for your great love, your great help. Thank you most of all for your forgiveness. Thank you for giving us a reason to live. Thank you for giving us love towards one another. Thank you for even helping us to love you. Thank you, you are a God of love. You created a perfect world in a perfect fashion. Thank you, we don't have to be in the dark about how you created the light. Oh, shine your light through us. Oh, please, Jesus, shine your light through us. Help us to love our spouses and love our children and love our friends as you've loved us. Amen. Thank you, everyone.